How you doing? Hope you're having a good evening. You've probably all begun to do your discussion posts for Workshop 1. That's great. You're going to have a paper coming up, quiz. Let's go ahead and get to it. And I'm going to get around to grading your discussion 1 post hopefully tonight. One thing I want to do each time we go through a new workshop, I want to present a little bit of a lecture type thing for you. This isn't really so much a lecture as it is just me just kind of talking about my thoughts and things about the subject at hand. I just want to say that these lectures are not to be a substitute for the textbook, but hopefully these little talks that I have will kind of enhance the material for you. So anyway, one thing I want to do first is start with a little scripture. This is out of Philippians chapter 1 verse 6. Says that he who began a good work in you will continue until the day of Jesus Christ, developing that good work and perfecting and bringing it all to full completion in you. So, is God concerned about your development? You bet he is. God wants to develop us into spiritually mature people. And spiritual growth and development is one thing we're going to talk about more and more as the class goes on. Just knowing that God loves you, and He's concerned about how you develop and how you turn out. So first, let me talk about the textbooks. The textbooks are pretty good. The Berger text, the big one, is a very good overview of developmental psychology. So it's going to hit the big theories and talk about the main people in the psychology discipline that have impacted the field. And it will talk about things not just from a psychological perspective, but also from a biological perspective, which is good. Also, cultural perspective. That's important too. Do your best to read it. I know we're all working adults and very busy, but I just encourage you to read your text as much as you can. The one thing that the Berger text does not do is it does not go into spiritual development very much, and that's something I feel is very important. The Fawcett text is about taking the psychology concepts and applying it directly to ministry and how you deal with people. I assume most of you are going to be dealing with or working with people as you go forward in your career in psychology, whether you're in this for the social work side or more of the psychology side. The Fawcett text is really good about that. And James Fowler wrote this book, as you can see, Stages of Faith. It's about growing in your faith and taking your faith and making it your own. And so it's just a really good theory about how faith develops in people. So we'll get into that. So next we're going to talk about the science of human development. Now, we're obviously going to start at the beginning. So first we're going to talk about how babies are made. Okay? So to do that, I have some diagrams I'm going to show you real quick. Just kidding. Nothing like that. I assume you've all been through health class in, 5th grade or whatever, and so we don't necessarily have to go into how babies are made. However, we are going to talk about things like genetics and what kind of role that plays in our development. The Berger text talks about the scientific method. Now, in psychology, the scientific method is very important because psychology tries to base at least most of its theories on the scientific method and proving them scientifically not just someone coming up with some random thoughts and putting them on paper. These theories that we'll discuss are pretty well thought out, but more importantly, they are tested. As you go through, you'll find that some are researched a little bit better than others. For example, we'll talk about Sigmund Freud and his developmental stages. Some of his stages will sound absurd, but what you have to understand is Freud was a doctor to start with, and he understood the scientific method. And his way of proving his theories was mostly through case studies. So he would take an individual, work with them, write down what he saw, and he did that numerous times, and that's how he developed his psychoanalytic theory. However, as we'll probably talk about later, case studies are not always the best method for proving a theory. You will see how the scientific method plays out in these other theorists, and how they came to the theories that they developed. So next is the whole nature versus nurture concept. Hopefully you have read about this in your text already. You might have talked about this in classes a little bit, but in developmental psychology, nature versus nurture is a very important concept, because you will find that nearly every theory kind of gravitates more towards the nature side or the nurture side. Now, the nature side basically says that our development is intrinsic and that it grows internally, and that our environment is not nearly as important. The nurture side, on the other hand, is the idea that our development is mostly impacted by our surroundings, our environment, and so the way we grow and develop is mostly based on the type of environment or the context that we are in. Now, it's important to note that both sides have a valid argument. And really, when it comes down to it, there's not one side that's 100% correct versus the other side. So, you have to remember that there are a number of things that affect how you develop. We're going to talk about biology. You can talk about personality type. You can talk about the culture that a person grows up in. Things like nutrition, very important. So all of those things kind of factor in, and you can't say 100% that it's nature intrinsically, our genes, our DNA essentially is what determines who we are. You can't say 100% it's the environment, and different psychologists and theorists will have their own view on to what extent the one side, nature or nurture, prevails. So, in my opinion, if I had to guess, I would say, now this is just my opinion, okay? I would say it's 60% nature, 40% nurture. What do I base that on? Just a hunch, basically. I haven't had time to test it out. It just seems like that. And there's been different points in my life where I've leaned more towards the nurturing side versus the nature. But that's where I am right now. I think the pendulum is just a little bit more towards the nature, the intrinsic side of things. I would say right now the field is definitely stronger towards the nature side of the argument. Now, let's talk about some theorists, right? First, there's basically 4 different main sort of schools of thought in psychology when it comes to developmental theory. First one is psychoanalysis, or the psychoanalytic theory. And as you probably know already, it was initially developed by Sigmund Freud. It was developed even further by Erickson, and they both had their stages of development, and these are psychological constructs of how we grow and develop as a person, how we mature internally. But you have to understand that the basis for psychoanalytic theory is the idea that the subconscious mind determines how well we develop. The idea is that there are these basic internal needs that guide our subconscious, and the subconscious then pushes us to act out in certain ways to just kind of be the people that we are, and that these internal needs and desires. Next came behaviorism. Now, psychoanalytic theory came in the very early 20th century. Most of it was based on this sort of internal subjective world of the subconscious. Along came theorists like Watson, Skinner, and Bandura, who said, you know what, if we're going to be a science-based discipline, we can't be having all this internal stuff going. We need to be more concerned about what we can prove and what we can measure. So, along came the school called behaviorism. And the behaviorist viewpoint is that it doesn't matter what goes on internally. It might or might not be there, but the fact is you can't measure those things, so why bother even talking about it? The only thing that really matters, according to the behaviorist, is learning via stimulus and response. So, you'll learn about Pavlov, the whole conditioning experiments, B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning, Bandura's social learning theory. Vygotsky kind of fits in there as well because his theories are more of a social learning based type of theory. So that's behaviorism. Next comes the cognitive school of thought. So cognitivism is essentially kind of a reprimand to the behaviorist thought. And people like Piaget came along and said, you know, it's fine that we can measure things, but the fact is we can think about stuff, and thought processes are very important. So cognitive is all about, you know, what goes on inside you mentally. How do you learn things? What processes does the mind go through in learning things? The thinking is sort of like this internal dialogue, and it's very important. How do we take in information and make meaning of it? Definitely the most important theorist in the cognitive area is Piaget. And I hope you spend some time looking at his theory and memorizing his stages, and because they're very important, and that's something that you're going to run into a lot probably as practitioners. Piaget's theories are very popular right now, and a lot of treatment and things for people are based off of Piaget's stages. So his stages were all about cognitive thinking, and how does that happen in children versus adolescents and adults and so on and so forth. The last set of theorists that I want to talk about is one that's kind of come up, I would say late 20th century up till now, and it's what I call the contemporary brain biology evolutionary theory, or what I call BBE, brain biology evolutionary theories. And basically this is all sort of the rage of modern day science, and it definitely has some merit, but you have to be careful not to exclude the other theories. So the brain behavior evolutionary way of thinking is that we are these mechanical biological organisms. Development is all about biology. It's all about your DNA. It's all about how we have, as a species, adapted through evolutionary means over time. It's the world that sort of like your neuropsychologists kind of dwell in. The BBE theories are also pretty big with sort of like the early behaviorists, people who kind of thought, you can't really prove anything unless you can measure it. And the BBE theorists tend to view psychology in ways that are pretty measurable, because it's all based on science and biology and anatomy and things like that. Now, I'm not trying to be controversial. I don't know what your views on evolution are, but it is a fact that if you're a practitioner in the psychology field, you're going to come in contact with these brain biology evolutionary type psychologists. Me personally, I believe to some extent evolution is there. I just think that God kind of guides it, more or less. Not that I believe that we all came from monkeys or anything like that. I don't believe that, but I do think that people and species can change over time. The last point I want to make is that all of these are just theories, okay? There's no 100% right answer. And that's kind of the beauty of psychology, in my opinion, is that you can take certain aspects of one theory and mix them with other aspects of another theory and come up with your own theory, I encourage you to really get a good handle on these theories and really understand them, and try to think critically about to what extent do you agree with these theories or disagree with them. Those are the questions to ask. The last thing I'll say is that, well, I just want to leave you with an example. I used to work in sort of the social work field, and I worked with families in a program called Early Head Start, working with families who have young children up to 3 years old. And I saw a lot of behavioral issues with those children. So I often had to ask myself, what is the root cause of this dysfunction or this behavior of this child? Is it an environmental thing? Yeah, probably for a lot of them. The environment has something to do with it. What about genetics? What about heredity? Does that have something to do with it? Well, I could definitely see that. I could see how the parents, how they could pass on some of that biology to the kid. Now, the behaviorists would say, no, that doesn't matter. All that matters is the external stimuli. Is just stimulus and response. Is the child learning? Is it not? Don't think about, what's going on. And the behaviorists would say, if you want to help that kid, all you have to do is set up a behavioral modification system with the right rewards or punishers. That behavior will change. And that's true to some extent. You can use behavior modification from the behaviorist perspective to change behavior in the short term. However, if you only stick to that realm of thought or that technique, you're going to miss out on really helping some people develop. You want to bring in some of Piaget's things and think about equilibrium in the child's learning, that they're just overstimulated, trying to take on too much. Is it a biological issue? Maybe the child needs medication. Who knows? But it's one of those things that it's going to take time as a practitioner and experience. But having a good understanding of these theories will certainly help you out a lot. I look forward to reading your papers and reading your posts and everything. As always, if you have any questions or anything, give me a call or email or message or whatever.